primarily what I think I'm presenting on today is more around gangs and youth violence. So we're talking more about the risk factors rather than maybe exactly how things work, but we'll get those going. So the first place to start seems to be, if we're talking about gangs, is about what are we talking about? What is a gang? And there are various descriptions that have been used over time, but the standard one that Home Office uses is Halsworth and Young. And so they talk about three groups. They talk about a peer group, which is a small organised transient grouping occupying the same space with a common history. But most important of all, crime is not integral to their group identity. So this is just a group of young people that maybe in the community people may feel a bit uncomfortable about, but there is no criminal activity there. Street gang, which is what people normally are talking about when they refer to as a gang, is a relatively durable, predominantly street-based group of young people who see themselves and are seen by others as a discernible group for whom crime and violence is integral to that group's identity. In earlier versions of this definition, there were things like have a link to a local geographical area or have colours that identify them, but actually increasingly as gang activities developed over London, these kind of things have become less the case. Where historically young people would be in a level of competition in some areas, what we find now is that what seems like they all sort of ended up in Brixton prison and realise that if they work together, frankly, you can make more money than if you're trying to hurt each other. And so what we're tending to find is there is much less of this postcode lottery that you used to find. And then the next group up is an organised criminal network. A group of individuals whom involvement in crime is a personal gain. The gain is mostly measured in financial terms. Crime is their occupation. And if you like, if predominantly street gangs are making their income from the distribution of drugs, it's these organised crime networks that would be bringing the drugs into the country. If you've got a street gang somewhere in Bow, for example, they are not shipping into the UK the opiates that they are selling. They are coming from organised criminal networks. I think what's really interesting about the picture in Tower Hamlets, I don't have a slide on it, another shorthand for gangs is the Metropolitan Police Force, Trident Command, who are the command that deal with gangs, have something called the Matrix. It's a risk assessment tool. So it was originally developed by Trident to be used to identify people who are gang affiliated and likely to perpetrate serious violence. It's now become shorthand for is someone a member of a gang. If they're on the Matrix, they're in a gang. If they're not on the Matrix, they're not. And that's caused us real trouble in Tower Hamlets because we have a large number of young people, predominantly young men, who are involved in low-level drug dealing in co-offending groups, but are not on the Matrix. They're not yet perpetrating the level of violence or violent offending that would get them onto the Matrix. And so quite often in safeguarding conferences, we'd have this difficult conversation about when is a gang a gang. We'd have a social worker who was really clear that their young person was involved in some kind of gang activity. The police officer would say, from the gangs team, would say, well, they're not in the Matrix, they're not in a gang. And so what we did is we developed this language of co-offending groups. So we still use the Matrix because it's a really useful risk assessment tool. I think it is really difficult when people try and push it beyond that. Really, it's a risk assessment tool for the police to task in terms of addressing violence. I think when we try and use it for more than that, it becomes problematic. But for that, it's really, really useful. It's been really useful for us to develop this middle group, which is sort of similar to a peer group, small transient grouping with limited organisational structure, occupying the same space with a common history, but where criminal co-offending has become integral to their group identity. And most of the time in Tower Hamlets, that will be low-level drug dealing. It can also be street robbery, unfortunately quite often knife-enabled, and also we have an element of the stealing of scooters and things like that. We're not a big borough for that. Predominantly, most of our street-level offending, at least with young people, is related to the supply of drugs. So, some gang facts and figures. This is for London as a whole, not just Tower Hamlets. So, there are 3,500 approximately gang members identified on the Matrix that I talked about, and they are distributed in 250 gangs. 70% of that grouping are 17 to 23. Tower Hamlets, well, in a second. 2/3 of gang members have also been victims of crime, so quite often victims become perpetrators. Most identified gang members in the Matrix are male, 98%, with only 40 females represented in total. We have no females in the Tower Hamlets Matrix. Majority of individuals identified as BME, 78% of all individuals, with white ethnic only being 10%, and that's representative of Tower Hamlets as well. Okay, so other key factors. Drug use, I'm just going to go back because I think I'm missing a slide. Okay. Other key factors. So drug use is exacerbated among gang-affected young people, also with an increase in experienced mental health issues. So quite often if young people are being involved in the supply of drugs, they've quite often been, not coerced, I'm going to get my thread back. So young people involved in the supply of drugs have quite often been groomed. Part of the grooming process is quite often to introduce them to the use of drugs. So quite often we find that drug use is aligned to gang membership, and there are mental health issues that can come along with that, along with, frankly, the stress of being involved in offending or as part of a gang. The normalisation of violence among both young people and their broader peer group, and also communities. I think what we do have an element of in Tower Hamlets is because we have quite a high level of knife crime. We have the highest level of knife crime with injury committed by those under 25 of any of the London boroughs. And when you have that high level of violence, it's no longer surprising. There's an element of normalisation. I think that is a problem. Social economic conditions worsening when those already in some of the worst deprived communities. So Tower Hamlets has many of the most deprived communities in London, and then if you add on to that you have a criminal offending history or any kind of criminal history, that also will further reduce your life opportunities and is problematic. And repetitive. Without intervention, the same choice behaviours recur across generations. What we have very commonly in Tower Hamlets is one of the key indicators for a young person being at risk of gang involvement is having an older sibling who has already been previously involved in gang activity. We had a thematic review a couple of years ago looking at some of these causes, and a very strong indicator was an older sibling who had also been involved in gangs or youth violence. This is the thing that I thought was before the last one, which has thrown me slightly, so I'll refine myself. So, Tower Hamlets, gangs profile. We still have one of the youngest profiles in London. The only borough that is close to us now is Waltham Forest. Currently, we don't have anyone under 16 on our matrix, but until recently, 30% of our matrix or identified gang members were aged under 18. We're now down to about 18%, but that's still a much, much higher number than would be the case in other boroughs. Until a year ago, we had the second highest number of gang flagged offences of any London borough. So we've had some real progress with bringing that down. We're now down to joint 5th, 6th. But I think on the whole, though people recognise there are problems in Tower Hamlets, historically people haven't thought of us having a greater number in terms of volume of gang offences than somewhere like Southwark or Lambeth. A year ago we did. We do have the highest number of offences in London, as I said, involving knife crime committed by offenders under 25. So we're not a firearms borough, fortunately, touch wood that we stay that way, but we have a very, very high level of knife carrying and knife injury, and it's something that we're looking to address as an absolute priority. High level of drug supply, related to the fact that Tower Hamlets has the highest number of heroin and crack cocaine users of any London borough. That is derived from us knowing that we have the highest number of people in treatment for both opiates and for crack of any of the London boroughs. I think it may even be nationally. So the assumption has to be either there is something going on locally that Tower Hamlets residents are more likely to seek treatment. There is no evidence for that, or the more likely conclusion, we have the highest level of usage. We definitely have what is understood by the police, I think, to be the highest level of supply. And we also have strong emerging evidence for county lines activity, CCE standing for child criminal exploitation. So we're having young people trafficked out of the borough to other parts of the country to be involved in drug supply. County lines has been in the news a lot recently. Is there any value in me giving a brief overview of that, or are people familiar with what county lines means? Okay, brief overview. So gangs derive a lot of their income in London from the supply of drugs. But there are a large number of gangs in London. So actually London has one of the most saturated drug markets in London, in the country, as do Birmingham and Manchester. So if you're a gang seeking to find an income from drug supply, one of the most dangerous and most difficult places that you could do it is going to be London, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool. What must have happened probably a decade ago is that a gang from somewhere went for a day trip to Margate, and realised that actually there was quite a drug supply, quite a drug market there, but it was underdeveloped, and frankly the local dealers weren't that scary. And so what then developed was a pattern of people from gangs from London trafficking young people to remote sites like Margate, for example, and most of the Essex coastline. And what they would do is they would go down there, they would intimidate the hell out of the local drug supply, they would set up their own crack houses or abandoned buildings where they could supply drugs from, and they would develop a market. And what they would do is they would traffic young people from London or other major cities to these coastal towns to actually run the drug supply for them. What we're now finding is happening quite a lot actually is because we have so many young people in placements out on the coastal areas, is that rather than traffic people from London, they'll go down to those coastal areas, recruit our young people there and exploit them locally. So county line in its simplest form is where drugs are being trafficked from one location to another. Sometimes it's as short as within London, and predominantly it involves the exploitation of young people to be involved in the supply of those drugs. The line actually refers to the telephone line. So quite often what happens is when drug dealers arrive in a new area, they will supply a number for a burner, a phone, and then that line is where people will ring and they are told where to go and buy their drugs. So the line in county lines refers to the phone line. Right, main gangs in Tower Hamlets. So historically, Roman Road, Bloodshedders and Aberfeldy are two of our biggest. Isle of Dogs not far behind, and Devon's Road Family the same. I think those four gangs have been very, very stable for a long period of time. Globe Town massive, more developed in the last 3-4 years. After them, the Jubilee Street massive, and after that we had a gang called S Block. What is interesting about S Block is that all of the other gangs actually developed in physical locations where people have developed in those areas. S Block were a group of young men who met in our pupil referral unit, established an identity from there, and then started offending in other parts of the borough. I've seen a few shaking heads as if I've got some gangs missing off of my list. It's quite interesting. It happens quite often. So I did a training a couple of months ago, and someone said, "Oh, you ain't got the Brick Lane Boys on there." And I've never heard of them before. So went back and checked with our gangs unit, and they didn't have the Brick Lane Boys either. So I think there are a couple of things this demonstrates. First of all, these groupings can be very transient and can move very, very quickly. And actually, it's only when they are sufficiently established and coming to the attention of the police that they will get on the matrix, that they'll be recognised as one of our established gangs. So I'm definitely not suggesting that this is a comprehensive list of each and every gang that exists in Tower Hamlets. They are the main ones that we have on our matrix. We have a couple of people on our matrix who are in Hackney gangs, but these are pretty much the gangs that we have on our matrix in Tower Hamlets at the moment. Why do young people join gangs? To fulfil an unmet need for support and nurture. Financial gain. Sometimes it's strictly as much as there's financial gain. For a sense of worth, identity and belonging. Peer pressure, that they want the reputation that goes with that. Protections are also a very strong one. There's been very little concrete research done into why young people carry weapons. The principal piece that's been done was a literature search done in Glasgow in, early 2010s. So it's not that new, but it came up with two principal reasons that people carry weapons. One is for the sense of identity and just for the reputation that it gives you, but also that you have people that genuinely feel fearful and feel that they are at risk, and so start carrying a knife for a sense of protection. And we get exactly the same with gangs, that people will join a gang because they feel that it enhances their reputation among their peer group or in their community, and also it gives them a sense of protection because they feel protected. Excitement. It can be quite exciting to be involved in a gang. And much more commonly, they are actively groomed and recruited. That gang members identify people that they wish to recruit and actually systematically set about recruiting them. We have the grooming line, which we either go through later or you can look through when the slides are distributed. They make a rational choice to join to be part of a gang. There are a number of young people that decide this is the best way forward for them. That doesn't mean that they're right, but within their frame of reference, they find themselves possibly in our alternative provision, and so their educational future is not looking absolutely great. If you come from some of the more deprived communities in the borough, it's not exactly that there are a large number of opportunities out there. I think the other thing that we found to be another risk factor is if you look at some of our communities, they're quite small and quite inward-looking. I'm reminded some years ago I did some youth work in the Isle of Dogs. It was the first time I'd ever worked there, and I took a group of 13-year-olds on a visit to the Tower of London. And they were 13. And out of a group of 10, 4 of them were saying, with absolutely no sense of irony, it was the first time in their lifetime they'd been off the Isle of Dogs. First time in their lifetime. Like, you've never heard of the DLR. And so if you have a really, really narrow life experience, if you have no idea of what is available to you, then how can you have a broader aspiration? And so I think that if you have a narrow worldview, no sense of what is the possible, but you see on television and the media all of these things that are possible through wealth that there is no obvious way of you getting, then actually, quite possibly, becoming a member of a gang and following that trajectory becomes a rational choice. I think it's about us broadening people's worldview, broadening their experience, so that they become aware of the alternatives. And also, very common, especially with co-offending groups, may not see themselves as belonging to a gang at all. I'm not a gang. I may be selling some drugs with my mates. I may be selling some drugs to my mates. We may be hanging out to it, but we're not a gang. So it's quite common that groups that we identify as gangs don't identify themselves as gangs. What do I do for time? I'm doing okay. Risk factors. So what are the behaviours that will give you an inkling that maybe a young person is at risk or is moving in this direction? A really, really strong indicator is going missing. It's one of the strongest ones, and actually it's one of the ones that early on gets missed the most. I think if there's one of the things I'd love to take away is to really encourage you that if you have parents that have children that are going to report it to us. We can only pick it up as an indicator when we get it reported to us. Quite often what we will find is that by the time a young person is reported to us as going and missing, they've already got a pattern 2-3 times that weren't flagged up to the local authorities. So really, really important that any young person going missing is reported as missing. Antisocial behaviour or antisocial peer group. So young people are getting involved in new behaviours where there is a group element and there is a group offending can take them in that direction. Drug or alcohol misuse, it's not absolutely the case that every young person who is involved in drug or alcohol use is a member of a gang, but it is an indicator. A loss of interest or a detachment from school or becoming truant. Again, it's not an absolute A goes to B, but it is a really strong indicator. A carrying of weapons. It's a strong indicator of becoming involved in gang or youth violence, but actually it's also a really strong indicator of a young person being at risk. And again, we'd always want that, we'd always want a MASH referral made for any young person who is found or understood to be carrying weapons. Inexplicable new clothing or cash. So if expensive clothing or money is arriving with no obvious reason, the chances are that is in the early stages more likely to be part of a grooming process rather than someone actively involved in drugs. But if we can get someone while they're being groomed, we have a chance to do some preventative work. Additional mobile phones, especially, I don't know about you, I know very few young people whose primary phone is some ancient Nokia, if Nokia still make phones. Predominantly we have new editions. So if someone's got a really cheap disposable phone, quite often they're referred to as burner phones, that is a really strong indicator that they may be becoming involved in either gangs or the dealing of drugs. Becoming secretive about friends and peers. I know that's a bit of a difficult one because I think that goes along with adolescence. So there's an element of suck and see with that. But again, I think what we're looking for when we're looking for risk is changes in behaviour. If we've got a young person who's always been a bit cagey about their social activity, that may not be. But if someone who has always been fairly open suddenly becomes that way, it can be a strong indicator. Home address located in a high-risk area. Nothing that a young person can do about it, but it is a risk factor. And being stopped by police with no gang members or in high-risk locations. Again, it's not an absolute dead cert, but it is a strong indicator. And it, with some of the others, builds a picture. So, other factors that can make young people at risk. Being neat, it's a very, very strong indicator if people are not in employed education or trade. History of victimisation or being bullied. Again, we have this phenomenon. It's not a foregone conclusion that all victims will become perpetrators. That would be a terrible disservice to do to victims to say that. So I'm not saying that, but it is a strong indicator. Sexually inappropriate behaviour. identified as being at risk, already a victim of sexual exploitation. So quite often we find that the kind of coercive control that can go with child sexual exploitation also goes with child criminal exploitation, and there is strong overlap between the two. That's how important we think going missing is. We put it in twice. Social isolation, lack of care, support or nurture. So if you have a young person who for whatever reason is not getting nurture, care and support within their family environment or within their peer group, like everyone else, they will look for it. And gangs are very good at identifying young people who are vulnerable in this way, and if not offering the real thing, then offering a very strong facsimile. Parents who either have mental health problems or drug or alcohol problems. It's in no way meant to say bad things about these parents, but it inhibits their capacity to be caring parents, and that puts young people at risk. Becoming beyond parental care or carer control. This is another very strong identifier that we have in strategy meetings, where we have young people who, for whatever reason, their families are unable to give sufficient boundaries and guidance to keep them on the straight and narrow, and it can veer off very, very quickly. So again, I think it's very, very important to identify very early. We as a borough have a strong investment in parental support programs and parental education programs, very keen to have early referrals to the Early Help Hub so that we can roll that out there, because much better to get it early and to pull it back in before it gets beyond control. Exposure to domestic violence is a really, really strong indicator for future violence. We're about to do a strategic needs assessment for the refresh of our gangs and youth violence strategy. And actually what we're going to do, as are the London Violence Reduction Unit, is it's effectively going to be a single JSNA through two prisms. One looking at youth violence, and but also looking at domestic violence and abuse, and looking at how the two cross over. As an older sibling with a history of involvement in gangs violence or drug dealing is a very, very strong indicator of a potential risk to do the same.
And you're going to hand over to me, aren't you? No, you can carry on pressing. Go on. Okay. Adam's very supportive of me, as you can see. Hi, those of you who don't know me, I'm Lisa Matthews. I'm the Vulnerable Adult Safeguarding Lead for the Borough of Tower Hamlets. One of our key concerns, you heard Adam say that gangs will groom young people. They will identify the young people they want to recruit. One of our big concerns in Vulnerable Adult Safeguarding is that it's some of our most vulnerable young adults that are being selected and groomed. Adam talked about the link with criminal and sexual exploitation. He talked quite a lot about the drugs exploitation, so I'll say something about the sexual exploitation. Frequently, it's not an unusual experience for young women to find that what seems like this new perfect boyfriend who's champagne and jewellery and encouraging them, that actually what he is a gang leader, and then what will happen for them. And these are sometimes some of our most vulnerable young women with behaviour problems or learning disabilities, that actually they'll find that they're less of a girlfriend and more an object to be shared among the whole gang over a period of time. Well, we share things in this group, in this gang, and that can sometimes lead on to them being used for prostitution. You've had all these presents, now you're going to have to pay the gang back. You know, these are the kind of real experiences that young people have talked to us about, and they've been groomed for those. It all seems lovely at first. The violence frequently doesn't come for a while. The threats don't come for a while. At first it seems lovely. So what Adam said about trying to intervene early is really, really important. And being drawn into the criminal justice system in itself is a massive, massive issue for vulnerable adults. We find that frequently young people are perceived by the public as threatening generally because they're young. So there's always a risk for any young person who might be shouting or whatever to be drawn into the justice system. And actually, the irony for us working with it is we have to police it. As Adam said, we need a gangs matrix. We need to work with that. So if vulnerable young adults with learning disabilities or emotional problems are being drawn into the gang network, they're going to come on our radar. There's going to be a chance that they're going to get convicted. They're likely to be seen as a perpetrator as much as a victim, because that gang will encourage them to do bad things. So the risks of their life being taken up by the criminal justice system and then being convicted, and once you are convicted, of course, that raises all sorts of other problems. It's more difficult to get work, it's more difficult to get a college place. All of these are problems that if we can intervene early, it's really important that we do. Substance misuse and addiction, Adam gave you the kind of background. Very frequently that's in the background of parents, and being drawn into substance misuse is a key way that gangs control vulnerable people. Frequently it will start off with sometimes people have told us in safeguarding, oh, the drugs were a present. And then I was told they weren't a present, that I owed the gang money for the drugs. And then I got to the point where I needed the drugs. I needed the drugs every day because I took crack cocaine, and the first time was wonderful and it felt really wonderful. And the second time wasn't quite as wonderful. And the third time I thought I really need this, and I find I need it more frequently. So actually now I'm locked into the gang because they provide me with the drugs. These are all real stories that we've heard from people. And the important thing that also happens with vulnerable adults when they get sucked into a gang is it isolates them from their other support networks. The gang becomes the new family. It becomes, they may, as Adam said, you're going to find truancy issues. So that means if they're dropping out of college, dropping out of school, dropping out of the job they had, then also those other networks, which used to be protective networks, that were encouraging them to be part of society and helping them get legitimate money and helping them get education, they're going to lose those networks. And the gang will become more and more dominant in their lives. And that diminishes their mental health and emotional well-being. And this is really, really important. Adam talked very eloquently about the upsides of gangs. And there is a real upside of belonging and the hard cash. And I remember the challenges myself of working in the youth offending team and earning considerably less than the young drug dealers in front of me who were earning 4 times what I earned in a week. But there's an element that actually you can't, money can't buy you something, and that is well-being and your sense of yourself. And actually, if your sense of yourself depends on a criminal group, that sense of yourself is ultimately going to feel flawed in places. And I mean, Adam will tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I've ever met any young person involved in a gang who didn't have some element of humanity still in them. And a lot of what's happening is they keep going down, the gang reinforces itself. On our risk tool in safeguarding, we identify it's an aggravator whenever a group is reinforcing a bad situation. So, to stop the gang members, to stop themselves looking at how awful their life actually is, the gang needs its rituals. Its rituals keep people together. Its rules keep people together. And that means they don't have to look at how awful it actually is. And if part of that is also not only violent rituals, violent words, infighting, it's also about drug addiction daily. Vulnerable young people's emotional well-being is very much threatened by that gang experienced. And the diminishment of life opportunities, and I could actually put a full stop after diminished life, because Adam referred to the amount of knife crime we have in the borough. It may well be that young people in gangs get a lot of money very fast. They sometimes don't live long to enjoy that. And there frequently are problems with not just knife attacks, but also fear of knife attacks. Living with that, to know that actually if you offend somebody in the gang, or you go against the gang, or you don't do what the gang needs to do, or you get nicked when actually they didn't want you to be nicked, the fear of those reprisals is going to feel terrible all of the time. And as I say, it can ultimately lead to young people's death. So I guess what I'm really saying here is it's really, really important, if you have concerns, that we try and get in and change things early so we don't ultimately get to the place where a young life is lost.
think you've got one more slide for you, just quickly, some other risk factors.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I'm just going to sort of zoom in, and then I'm going to sit down again and give it back to Adam. I'm just going to zoom in on some of the key issues for our most vulnerable young people and how they relate to gangs. Learning disabilities. In this borough, we have an extremely large amount of young people with learning disabilities. We have a large amount of young people who are statemented in school. And we have a large amount of vulnerable adults who grew up with a mild or severe learning disability. And gangs groom and actively target people with learning disabilities because they can encourage them to do risky things. And that person with learning disabilities may not have such a strong sense of the danger that they're putting themselves into. They can be more easy to manipulate. And our concern in adult safeguarding is that actually a mild learning disability is more of a risk than a major, serious learning disability. And the reason I say that is that if you have a severe learning disability in this borough, you're very likely to meet the threshold to have support from our integrated community learning disabilities team, which is based here at the hospital and is an integrated team with social care and clinicians. And actually, if you get that service, that will probably be a very strong protective factor in your life, because you will have clinicians looking after you, and you will have social work support, and your family will have a lot of support, and people are going to spot something if something starts to happen in your life, like suddenly you have a lot more cash and you're being groomed by a gang. We're going to get in there and do something about it because we already know you very well. But actually we believe we know there's a cohort of young people with mild learning disabilities who've been groomed by gangs, many known to the youth offending team where Adam works, and they're not going to meet that threshold. When they stop being a child, they're not going to meet that threshold for our integrated community learning disabilities team. So there isn't actually an ongoing service which is going to be there for them through their lives, because they have only a mild learning disability. So what we will try and do in safeguarding is to try and do some short-term limited intervention to reduce those risks. But it's a very, very difficult business. Very often those young people are the only nurturing they're getting is either from the gang or the criminal justice system, where many of them will end up. And actually it isn't easy for us to engage with them in safeguarding. We also have a large number of young people in this borough with physical disabilities. We have very large numbers of deaf young people. And actually, whilst you might not think that actually drug dealers out there, gang leaders who are very clever indeed, would want disabled kids on their team, that's not true. What we hear from the ground is that deafness is very useful to a gang, and they actively recruit deaf young people to be foot soldiers in gangs and carry the drugs, do the county line stuff that Adam talked about, be the patsy that takes the drugs from here to there, so they're likely to be caught if anyone's going to be caught. Because if you're deaf, that's much harder for the police to deal with. The police only have a certain amount of time to interview people before they have to charge or release them. And the fact that they've got a deaf young person in front of them makes that communication difficult. They have to get an interpreter in, and there are times, we've been told, where police have not been able to charge because actually the person in front of them's deaf and they haven't got an interpreter in the time, or they haven't got the evidence they need in the time. So we know that deaf young people are out there being actively groomed by gangs. And the whole issue of isolation. You in your professions very much understand families and individuals, and where families may be isolated or where individuals are isolated. And that isolation is a massive risk factor. A lot of our vulnerable young people are living very, very challenged lives. This week we've been working with a young person who is completely alone He is a refugee from Afghanistan. He's 19 now. He saw his father executed in Afghanistan, and on the journey back through to try and get here to seek asylum, he was with his mother and he lost contact with his mother, and we don't know where he is. So he is completely alone here, and he's been supported by children's services. But his behaviours are, some of them, very, very challenging, not surprisingly, given what he's been through. He can be difficult, he can be violent, and actually it's really important that we work with him and that we stay with him and support him as a young adult, and we've allocated him a safeguarding social worker to do that, because if we don't stay with him, he's going to be ideal as an isolated young person to become part of a gang. And the whole issue of substance misuse, Adam's already talked about it, so I'll just give it the vulnerable adult flavour. Vulnerable adults are very, very open to being groomed for substance misuse. If you're a vulnerable adult, and I'm nobody's expert on benefits, it always confuses me, but if you're a vulnerable adult, frequently you're on a relatively high amount of benefit because of the allowances you get because of your disability. That is rich pickings for drugs gangs, because there's money that can be spent there by that vulnerable adult buying drugs, and then that will link them in with the gang and keep them there. So I hope I've made my point that actually, although the stereotype perhaps that's out there in the media of the gang person is this tough young person, actually it's our most vulnerable young people who are at risk of being groomed in. Thanks, Adam.
Absolute pleasure. So the reason I wanted to put the grooming line is to demonstrate that grooming is actually quite a sophisticated, well-developed process. That I'm sure that large number of our gang novels who are grooming young men or women don't have this in front of them, but there is a very strong methodology that is followed. There is the targeting stage, where people are actually choosing who to groom, who is most vulnerable, who has the vulnerabilities, who's going to be most likely to be vulnerable. So I have a colleague who does a lot of training as well, who describes some of the grooming. One of the things he identifies as a really strong form of the targeting stage is taking a young person shopping, buying them something expensive, and then seeing if they can hide it at home. He talks about taking a young person shopping to buy them, I'm afraid not big on trainers, but trainers that are worth hundreds and hundreds of pounds, and you have a child go home with them and see if they can hide them. And if the parent doesn't come and make a fuss, then you know that this child can manage somewhere in their home to secrete a box so big, so big, so big, which is more than enough to carry a weapon or drugs or money. And so you buy a pair of trainers. If the parent comes and makes a huge fuss, okay, you've lost a couple of £100. But if there is absolutely no feedback at all, not only have you started a relationship building process with that young person, but with that simple transaction, you've established that they can hold on to and hide a box so big, which is a really useful and valuable thing to have. The friendship forming stage, where you start forming a relationship, making friends, finding commonality. I think that the no one understands you quite like I do. It's very, very common with young people. Moving beyond that, a loving relationship stage, a setting up of a greater dependence, a greater closeness, you can depend on me, I can depend on you, and this then develops into the abusive stage, where if you love me, you'll do this for me, and if not, it can also move into an element of threatening behaviour, physical violence, or sexual assault as a form of control and power rather than anything else. I think what we'll do is, this is in the slides that are being distributed. I think our contact details are on the end. If anyone wants any more detail about this, please come. We could do an entire day's training on the grooming line. I think we're actually developing one. So probably best to leave it at that. But if you want more details, our contact details are at the end. Please do get in touch. So, local services. So the primary thing that we have is the COG panel. So it's a multi-agency panel. Actually, its monthly meeting was this morning. And what happens is young people who are identified as being high risk are discussed, and we look at, in a multi-agency meeting with a fair number of partners around there, what we can put in place either to ameliorate and move young people away, or if young people are heavily involved in gangs, to help them step away and exit. The methodology for making a referral to the COG panel is if you refer into MASH. So we have the multi-agency safeguarding hub. If you have a young person who you think is at risk, if you refer them into MASH, if they cross the threshold for referral to COG, MASH will do that.
What's MASH?
Oh, sorry. So multi-agency safeguarding hub is what MASH stands for. That's a fairly standard local authority acronym, I think. COG is just short for co-offending groups. We had this issue about when is a gang a gang. The alternative language that's used up in Salford is organised crime group. Now, when I first came into post, there was an issue about whether Tower Hamlets did or did not have a gang problem. And having just established a gang problem, I thought if I suggested we also had an organised crime group problem, I probably wouldn't be in post for very long. So COG was relatively short, and it's just co-offending groups. It's a shorthand which we use locally. One of the principal services that we use in terms of supporting young people is the St Giles SOS project. They are represented across most of the London boroughs. We now have 3 SOS workers embedded either with the exploitation hub or with the youth offending team. The way to access those is through referral to COG, which goes through the MASH. And now I'm using a large number of acronyms, aren't I? Sorry about that. The next thing we have just recently, in the last 6 months, developed an integrated exploitation hub, and actually we've also followed what Hackney do by having an integrated gangs team within that. What that means is that at Mulberry Place we now have a co-located team of the police exploitation team who will have active operations against people who are identified as exploiting young people and seek to bring them to justice for that. But sitting with them, we have a social work team as well as our St Giles SOS workers to offer the support and the statutory intervention together. So again, the way to access that, if you have a young person that you think is at risk of exploitation, is to make the referral into the MASH, and again, they will make the referral onto the exploitation hub. The Youth Justice Service, a large number of the young people come to us, and so that is where a level of support is offered. Children's social care, obviously for the statutory obligations, and the youth service. Another very strong service we have in the borough is Spotlight. They have 6 youth services which will cover the spaces that aren't covered by our own youth provision, and they're a very strong service, and we do them very strongly. Fight for Peace are actually a Newham service, but they welcome referrals from Tower Hamlets. They grew out of a service out of Brazil. They offer boxing and martial arts as a way into their programme. So if your young person's not interested, they're probably not going to do much. But they use martial arts and boxing as the hook on which to get people involved. They have a really strong physical training programme, but alongside that they have a very strong, if you like, ethics and values-based approach based on their 5 pillars, which I'm not going to remember today, so I'm not even going to try. But they have a very, very strong methodology to engaging with young people. On top of that, they have a really, really strong vocational guidance and routes into employment package, and they also have strong links with a number of arts organisations. One over an organisation called Lifebeat, so they send a number of their young people away for summer creative camps with Lifebeat. So they have a very rich offer. So if you have a young person that you are seeking to divert away, who is willing to travel to William V DLR, they're a 5-minute walk away from there, and has an interest in boxing or martial arts, we rate them highly, and they do some really, really good work. Step Forward are the psychological therapies service that we have. They're a voluntary organisation based over in Bethnal Green, do some fantastic work, and again, can't speak highly of them. Prince's Trust, probably more people either lower down the scale or who've come through. They're not maybe the best at really acute work, but have some fantastic projects for supporting young people back towards education and training. Streets of Growth, a very similar project. Divert are a service that are based in the custody suite at Bethnal Green, and again offer diversion into employment for young people or adults who are willing to make use of it. Probation and IOM, I've just forgotten what the acronym stands for.
Integrated Offender Management.
So high-risk offenders go into the IOM, and it's a multi-agency way of managing offenders. Women's Aid, very, very good at supporting women who need support. CAMS, obviously the Adolescent Mental Health Service for young people. London Gang Exit Programme is funded by MOPAC, it's delivered by Safer London, and they offered a structured programme for young people who are seeking to step away from gang activity. It was originally set up on the basis of an election promise made by Boris, where he made this promise that we would exit 200 young men from gangs in a year. The problem is that gang exit doesn't really work that way. When I sat down with peers when it was being set up, we struggled to identify, I think it was 25 young people across all of London that fitted the criteria. So the criteria for London Gang Exit has developed over time, so it's not young people that need support with stepping away. The one big problem with it is they have no housing. Quite often one of the things that young people or families who are looking to move away from gang need is a relocation. Unfortunately, London Gang Exit can't help with that. The way to do that is going to be through the Homeless Persons Unit. Rescue and Response is a service that's just mobilising now. Again, MOPAC funded, and what it is, it provides a single point of contact in London for young people who have been trafficked either within London or outside of London, so that one of the problems with recovering young people who have been trafficked to, for example, Margate, is in London people have enough trouble getting their heads around the 32 boroughs. So you have police forces in remote areas who know a young person comes from London, but they tell you they come from Bethnal Green, so they try and look up the London Borough of Bethnal Green and get nowhere. So there's been a real problem having people referred back. So Rescue and Response provides a single point of contact for outside boroughs. The other thing that's been recently set up is the National County Lines Coordination Centre, which is based in Birmingham. The point of contact for that will be Rescue and Response. So they get informed about young people. They have a really developing analytical capacity, so we can better understand the picture, because we don't have a good understanding of it. And then also both St Giles and Abbey Ander are providing a support service for young people who are returning from being exploited, to support them around that. And then also Victim Support, a very strong agency for supporting victims. I think this one's yours.
This is me. I'm just going to close off. Thank you very much. What we would like to say to you is we hope we've made the point that the risks of the young people that you work with are going to be all around you. So what we very much are going to say to you that we want you to do are these things. We think you're in a very important role, knowing families and understanding them. So if you can think about what you see in front of you and engage with the family dynamics, whoever comes to see you know, whether that's the parents or the young person themselves or both, if you can seek to understand those family dynamics and where, you know, is the young person in the family involved in a gang? Are they at risk of being involved in the gang? Are the parents showing some of the behaviours that Adam talked about the domestic abuse that could make things very difficult and dangerous, or the use of substances themselves, which are going to raise the risks to the young person and indeed to them? We want you to think about these things because they're far more likely to come to you first than to me as a social worker, because you're actually the people that families go to first for so many things. So if you can be alert to the issues and engage with the family dynamics, then you're like our eyes and ears, that you can help us to do the prevention work that will ultimately help young people and save lives. And very much it's about curiosity. It's about being curious about what's going on in that family. And asking questions, asking the family if that feels appropriate to do so, or letting us know so that we can ask the questions. But actually being curious about what's going on and what lies behind things is what good safeguarding is all about. And if you have concerns, we'd ask that you call one of these two numbers, and please do write them down if you want to, but we're going to circulate this. We have two safeguarding front doors. The front door for Children's Services is located in the multi-agency safeguarding hub that Adam mentioned, and that's their number, 0207 364 5006. We also have a safeguarding adults hotline. So if this is about a young person who is, say, 18, 19, you can call us. We don't mind if you call us as well on the adult hotline if they're 16. We're going to talk to our colleagues in Children's Services anyway. Please don't think you can't call us. You know, if you're not sure, give us a call. And again, it's 0207 364, which gets you through to the council, and 6085 for the Safeguarding Adults hotline. If you're not sure, call anyway, because it's staffed by a social worker who's